the title is a little bit intimidating. That's very broad. I don't know how I can do that in 20 minutes. But really, I think the main thing I would love to, inshallah, do together today is I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, but I also every now and then I want to give an example that hopefully most of us or all of us can actually relate to when it comes to our personal or communal practice of zakah on both levels, collection and distribution as well. So we'll go back and forth between, for example, the ayat al-sadaqah, the verse that I recited about the recipients of zakah, do some reflections, also highlight certain points in tafsir and legal traditions have spoken about the very minute details of how the ayah is structured, how the certain linguistic devices are being employed in the verse to guide our understanding of how to, one, identify who is the eligible recipient, and two, as Sheikh Fuad mentioned, how to prioritize possibly the recipients of zakah. First, I would share a little bit of qualitative data on how American Muslims are both perceiving and distributing zakah. Briefly, there are multiple other sets of data that came out actually recently in the last 2 years. And then we'll give some theological and legal context and definitions. Then we'll talk about deserving recipients, which I think this is one of the most critical parts of the presentation. We'll talk about textual interpretive analyses, giving examples from tafsir and legal tradition on how, again, scholars understood that verse of the 8 recipients of zakah. And then if we have time, and I'm sure this last point will come up a lot in the discussions throughout the day, inshallah, contemporary definitional expansion. So how we are reinterpreting some of the categories in the ayah and how the Muslim community is perceiving and understanding these definitions. This is an example of relatively old. It sounds funny when you say old about 2019, but it sounds a little bit old now for about 5 years or more. On philanthropy practices by American Muslims. Again, there are a couple more qualitative data that came out, I think in 2022, and there is one that came early 2023 by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. They've just published a report. I'm not sure if it's public yet, but yeah, it's not something that I had a chance to incorporate here. They have some more interesting data on other dimensions, but this is really the most relevant part to our discussion today. This was done by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding in 2019. It just gives us an understanding of how American Muslims are given their zakah. I don't think most of us will be surprised that house of worship is really among the top when it comes to allocating sadaqah or zakah for. And by the way, this was done on both zakah and sadaqah, so both the compulsory annual zakah that is obligatory and also on the voluntary sadaqah, so it's not just about zakah. So we should keep that in mind when we read the numbers. The one by the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy is more focused on zakah. Domestic poverty, 60%, education, other 60%. You can see now the breakdown of the numbers. It doesn't really sound too surprising. The main thing I will share about what the Lilly School of Philanthropy has basically found in their most recent research was that it's a very common notion in the Muslim community that most of the zakah money goes abroad. I'm sure a lot of us heard this before. This is a very common question, like we take zakah money, we send it abroad. And recently with the situation that happened in Gaza, for example, a lot of community members are discussing why don't we use this money here and possibly we can influence foreign policy of this country, and then maybe you can prevent some of these humanitarian problems that happen abroad that we eventually are going to send millions of dollars of zakah for. Aside from the whole framework of discussion, which again I'm sure is going to come up again today, what was interesting about this most recent qualitative data on zakah is that actually American Muslims pay a larger amount domestically than what they send abroad. I personally was a little bit surprised about this because I conceded with that common perception by most Muslims that, yeah, we send all the money abroad, or most of the money abroad, but actually still a lot of Muslims. I think the sample data was over 3,000 Muslims that were interviewed, so it's kind of a good representative data. So a lot of the money is actually being still spent domestically, and of course across various aspects or different institutions and individuals. And also another interesting finding was that a lot of Muslims still prioritize individual giving, so finding who is the poor, who is the needy, who is in debt, or one of the categories, and then going and giving them the money directly. versus given institutions, which was also a little bit surprising because the common perception was Muslims pay to institutions, whether it's a relief organization or the mosque or the Islamic school or whatever non-profit, but it's still individual giving of zakat is something that a lot of American Muslims continue to uphold. At the bottom, this is just a very small study on practice of zakat in Canada. It's not by any means very representative, but I'm Canadian, so I have to mention Canada somehow. So it's something that Americans always forget about Canada. So that's why I felt like we should really appreciate that. We have a significant number of Muslims in Canada as well. You find a lot of kind of similarities between Canada and the US when it comes to the communal practices, the communal understanding, perception, and the communal practices, again, of both collection and distribution of zakat as well. So again, that's just a very quick glimpse of how zakat is distributed in the US. Now let's have some reflections on how to understand zakat from a Quranic perspective. Of course, everybody knows zakat is mentioned in the Quran many times, approximately about 30 times. Maybe 27 out of the 30 is conjoined with salah. So aqimu salah wa atu zakah, establish prayer and pay zakat. It's very common in the Quran. And then a few times, like 2 or 3 times, zakat is mentioned by itself. Now, do we mean zakat, whatever derivative of this exact word, or sometimes Quran uses sadaqah and it means zakat, or it means both? So Quran uses more than one word that denotes this idea of a charity giving. Like for example, the ayah of the eligible recipient doesn't use zakat, it uses sadaqat, like the general term, even though it was understood by all the scholars that this verse talks about zakat, the compulsory, the obligatory zakat specifically, but sometimes the Quran and the Prophet ﷺ would also use the word sadaqah, but he is intending zakat in the kind of legal sense that we understand it. In a famous incident when the Prophet sent Mu'adh ibn Jabal, one of the companions, to Yemen to teach people Islam, so he was instructing him what to tell people there and what to educate people on. So on that, when he mentioned Quran and Salah and other things, but when he mentioned zakah, he said, فَأَخْبِرْهُمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ فَرَضَ عَلَيْهِمْ صَدَقَةً. Here is the use of the word sadaqah again. Then tell them that Allah has enjoined on them a charity. تُؤْخَذُ مِنْ أَغْنِيَائِهِمْ فَتُرَدُّ عَلَى فُقَرَائِهِمْ. To be taken from the rich and given to the poor. It sounds a simple sentence or a simple statement, but it attracted a lot of kind of discussions in our tradition. Of course, you can reflect on it from a kind of social obligation perspective and how zakah endorses a principle of distributive justice. But from a strict legal interpretive perspective, I just want you to make a note of the pronouns that the Prophet is using here. Taken from their, actually I wanted to maybe bold or underline that word. Their rich given to their poor. And then you have all these discussions. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give some theory, some kind of applications. So this prompted at least 2 major discussions in the tradition. One is zakah by default a local practice. Because like they're rich to the poor, so it should stay within the community. That should be the priority. And again, we'll talk about priorities a lot. That's one. 2, which is a little bit more controversial, أغنيائهم فقرائهم. They're rich to the poor. That means Muslim rich, Muslim poor. So is zakah limited only to Muslim population and cannot be given to non-Muslims? That was another discussion. Majority of the traditional legal tradition said, yes, zakah is only for Muslims, except very few exceptions like مُؤَلَّفَةِ قُلُوبُهُمْ, those who are hard to be winning over or to be reconciled for particular purposes that we'll talk about that category. But in general, zakah should be for Muslims. Sadaqah you can give to Muslims and non-Muslims as well. However, we have ongoing discussions among the community members about, okay, can in some situations, specifically in relief situations, use zakah funds to pay to non-Muslims as well. Let's say the wildfires in Southern California, and now Islamic Relief wants to come in and just like distribute zakah funds to people who have been harmed by this. Then I use Islamic Relief as just a kind of a random example here. But like any relief organization, would they have to dictate that I'm going to use zakat to give only Muslims who were harmed by this, but I cannot use sadaqah in that? So, and that prompted again the discussion, okay, can we expand the categories of zakat to include non-Muslims? And then now we refer back to this hadith and we start doing this kind of interpretive analysis. What did the Prophet mean? Did he mean this is zakat, this is the obligatory annual kind of, I don't like using the word tax about zakat, but let's call it, just for the lack of a better word, an annual religious tax that you pay, then it should be limited, or it should circulate just among community members. Something important, back to theory, when we think of the purpose of any Shari'i law, many scholars of Usul al-Fiqh and Ghazali actually articulated this in a very nice way. Said that when you find any legal injunction in Islam, it will fall under one of three dimensions. So whether it's purely devotional, something you do ta'abbudi, you do because Allah wants you to do it for kind of ritualistic purposes. And he gives the example of Hajj, for example. You go to Hajj and then you throw the pebbles or the stones at the shaitan. Like, you can reflect on that spiritually a lot, but you know that you're doing this out of submission to the command of Allah of doing that. The shaitan doesn't have to be physically in that space that you are stoning, but you just like, it's all spiritual about like, okay, I'm declaring that I'm really anti-shaitan. I'm really just like want to expel any kind of shaitanic thoughts or presence in my life. So it has a spiritual kind of benefit to the Muslim, but the very rational purpose of this command by Allah is something that primarily devotional. It's not necessarily something that is rational in a tangible or materialistic sense. Same thing about the number of prayers. It's 5, it's not 4, it's not 6. So again, we can reflect on the hikmah and the wisdom behind that, but the major underlying principle is it's ta'abbudi. It's a command from Allah to test your servitude or to test your commitment to the Islam. Then there is a rational, that's on the other side of the spectrum, something very rational. You took it from someone, you have to pay it back. That's rational. This is right, and this right needs to be paid back to the person. So you can easily rationalize this as a religious command. And then, interestingly, Ghazali said, like, zakah is a mix of both. So he said there is a very devotional aspect of zakah, and there is also obviously very rational aspect of zakah. So when we reflect on all kind of social justice and taking care of the vulnerable members of the community, we can, of course, list a very long list of benefits, rational benefits of zakah, socially and otherwise. But also he said we should not neglect the devotional aspect of that. So for example, and that goes back to how we understand the ayah of the eligible recipients. If the Quran specifies 8, then we shouldn't add 9th. If the Quran specifies these 8, then we should exhaust our resources to identify these 8, to find where these 8 are, and then try to give them this money. If the Quran, and that's a lot of these points are debatable between different schools of law, but if the Quran meant it to be equitable distribution, then we should equally divide the money between these 8 people. So if this is what we are going to agree on as jurists and Muslims, then we need to stick to that. If we find some counter-rational argument to our conclusion, we should set it aside. Because this is what the Quran said, assuming, again, we agree that this is what the Quran said. So I would imagine this is an argument for people who would not accept giving zakat to a Muslim. And then say, like, you can rationalize that in a lot of situations, but you can say, well, this is how the Quran and the Sunnah frame the zakah that has to be paid to Muslims. We understand the rational benefit of expanding the category, but we have sadaqah to do that. We have probably waqf, we have probably wasiyah. So there are other institutional giving in Islam that can cover a lot of these other causes. But zakah, because it's devotional, it's part of what makes a Muslim Muslim, because it's part of the 5 pillars of Islam. It really shapes and completes the identity of Muslim. Then let's stick to that. And again, that has multiple legal applications. And Ghazali was saying that describes the philosophy of a whole law school when it comes to zakah, like the Shafi'is versus the Hanafis, for example. He gave that example. If somebody prioritizes the devotional aspect, that will affect the legal conclusion. If somebody is prioritizing the rational aspect, that will also affect their legal conclusions as well. So see how the overall kind of approach to what zakah is and what zakah is for will determine a lot of legal applications, even by, of course, the major and founders of schools of law in our history. So zakah is unique in that sense. It's not purely devotional, it's not purely rational, it's kind of a mix of both. One last point about this taxonomy that Ghazali provides is that it's very crucial when we apply legal analogy to come to new conclusions about points of law. If something is purely devotional, then by default, and again, a lot of things have further discussions in usul and law, but by default, if something is purely devotional, then you're very limited in analogizing things to it. So if we agree that this hukm, this command from Allah is something that is purely devotional, then you're not really expected to do a lot of qiyas on this. You're not going to, like for example, the famous debate in legal theory about rukhsa. If you have the rukhsa of shortening prayers when you're traveling or breaking your fast when you're traveling or something like that, if this is kind of an exception to the rule, then just this is the only thing that you're allowed to do, you can analogize that exception to other situations as well, at least by default. You cannot do that because this is an exception that is meant to be purely devotional. The exact opposite of rational. If you have something rational, then you can analogize a lot of new points of law based on that. Zakah will become tricky because it's a mix of both. So where to draw analogies and where not, this really kind of a point that requires a lot of kind of legal reasoning. Now, speaking of the bigger picture, so the way we think of zakah is really determined by the way we think of wealth and rizq from an Islamic, both theological and spiritual perspective. There's this very interesting debate in Islamic theology about is rizq what I own or what I actually utilize? So whatever I have of positions, whatever I have in my bank account, whatever properties I have, all of that is rizq. And by the way, that's a theological question, not a legal question. So like, of course, these are your own. So we're not talking about legal ownership. That's all your positions, and you legally own these things, and you have the right over these things. But the question is theological. Is it what I'm at the moment utilizing and benefiting from, or is it whatever I own? And then actually a lot of them said, no, it is what you actually are currently at the moment utilizing and using. Why? Because you might die right now. And then the money that is in my bank account is not going to be mine anymore. It's going to be my heirs or my family. Whatever money that I'm not doing intifa', that I'm not actually using it at the moment, then it's not really my risk, because you don't know if that will continue to be your risk, or you don't know if you're going to consume this before you die or before the money is lost. It's not just about death. The money is, la qaddar Allah, it's just like lost, stolen, damaged, whatever happened to any of property, we didn't know. So this theological conception is very crucial, and that's something that most Sunni scholars agreed on, that said, theologically speaking, it's what you actually use and utilize now, and that should drive your thinking about giving and sadaqah. So when we say the hadith that every fundraising you attend, you will hear, مَا نَقَصَ مَالٌ مِّن صَدَقَةٍ, like when you donate, your money doesn't actually, your wealth doesn't decrease, it actually increases. It's not just about spiritual barakah. There is actually really like a kind of a deeper theological conception to this, that it really increases when you think of rizq in this very wider perspective. Now, just because we have a limited time, for the sake of background, this is how a lot of fuqaha or jurists think of wealth. You have money, anything that can be possessed and utilized. You have the cash, the naqd, traditionally gold and silver, or today's currencies. Then you have staple food, crops. This covers most of what we can define as mal, as money in a very general sense. And then the way, again, you develop this taxonomy will trigger some other questions about services, for example. Is this considered to be money or not? About a license, about intellectual property. So a lot of subsidiary questions will be included, but all of that can be discussed under wealth. What constitutes something that has monetary value? And therefore, this is how we think about it when it comes to wealth and wealth distribution in Islam. Also, zakah is interested in the question of wealth growth, because usually you also hear about the rulings of zakah if it's intended for growth, or it's self-generated wealth, or wealth designated for growth. It's usually what the zakah is on. If it's not, then it might draw other kind of applications, such as non-growing assets or assets unlawfully controlled by others. If somebody lost their property, or they're not sure when their property can be paid or given back to them. So the idea of money, self-generated wealth or designated for wealth. So the idea of growth in zakah is something that is also very fundamental in deciding on a lot of ahkam that will follow when it comes to the distribution. When we think of zakah, there are multiple definitions. Of course, zakah itself, which you're kind of familiar with. Then there's the nisab, the minimum thresholds of wealth and money that a person needs to possess to be obligated to pay zakah. And then there is the hawl, the one lunar year. Every year it's an annual charity that a Muslim has to pay. So every lunar year, the person has to pay 2.5, if we're talking about kind of income or naqd or cash zakah. Everybody who is Muslim possessing wealth, zakatable wealth, because there is zakatable and non-zakatable wealth, has complete ownership. And the idea of complete ownership, that drives a lot of questions as well. People ask, I think in the description of the seminar, there is a question or a point on 401k. So 401k always drives a question of complete ownership. Is this something that I actually have complete ownership and capacity to transact or dispose or not? And also possesses, of course, that minimum threshold, the zakah payable amount. for a type of property, and then hold that threshold plus for an entire loaner year to now be obligated to pay 2.5. Every one of these 5 kind of conditions of obligation, you'll find a lot of examples that we need to discuss in today's applications. So for example, somebody who's underage, a minor, and they possess property or they have some kind of money or wealth, then the guardians of Zakat on this or not. That's a point of discussion that will follow how we determine the conditions of eligibility when it comes to Zakat. Zakatable wealth, the question of jewelries for women, for example, is another point of, and every one of these points is like debatable between different schools of law. Incomplete ownership, inaccessible money or property that has been wrongfully seized, stolen, lost, loaned to someone. All these applications, again, these are conditions of the obligation of Zakah, and then every condition will have these different questions that come underneath them and different legal applications that will follow. So these are the 8 eligible recipients of zakah that we recited in the ayah. Poor, those short of money, faqir and miskin, zakah workers, al-amilina alayha, those whose hearts are to be reconciled or to be won over, al-mu'allafati qulubuhum, slaves purchasing their freedom, al-mukatab or fi riqab, those in debt, and we have multiple types of debts that qualify for zakah, those fighting for the cause of Allah, fi sabilillah, and travelers needing money, wabn sabil. So these are the 8 categories that were mentioned in the ayah. Let's just give some quick examples of how we think about the verse of sadaqat of these 8 categories. First of all, most books of tafsir will note that the ayah begins with innama, and it's a kind of a it emphasizes exclusivity, so it's hasr. Like innama means like sadaqat, zakah is only for, and then now you basically put a colon and list these 8 categories. So there is a little bit of exclusivity of eligible recipients that have to be within these 8. We can discuss the expansion of the definition of one of the 8, but you can't add a 9th category. This is basically the point of exclusivity here, that innama, that this linguistic device has actually denoted this. And then that restrictive linguistic style tells us that the categories are limited to 8, as we mentioned. Also, the exclusivity of the 8 and the way they're conjunctively like connected in the ayah, للفقراء والمساكين, and the ayah actually alternates in the style, so it doesn't use one style of conjunction between the 8 categories. Interestingly, there's a denotation here that there are independent definitions for each category. So you need you as the jurist, you need to think about probably other ayat in the Quran and then the prophetic practices, and then come up with a definition of each of these 8 categories. And then an implication can be understood that these categories should not overlap by default. They're independent. So if they overlap a lot, then we dismiss the idea of these conjunctions between the 8. When you say 1, 2, 3, I know the ayah doesn't say that in numbers, but the ayah lists them in a kind of a very style of a list. There was a discussion about lil fuqara, so the ayah said for, and then that's a lam, and they say, okay, lam here means that there's a kind of a transfer of ownership that is given to that person. So the idea of tamlik, individual ownership, that I have the money, I give it to the poor. But the ayah doesn't use the lam for all the 8 categories. Use them for the first 4. So give it to, so transfer the ownership of zakat to the poor, to the needy, the miskin, to the zakat workers, and to those whose hearts to be reconciled. And then all of a sudden the ayah shifted to use fi, and in the cause of Allah, and in. So it used like a different preposition from the first one. And that made the scholars also think about, okay, so there are 2 different kind of sets of categories, for and for. So we understand fi, in, as to be in this cause. So there's kind of maybe restriction in how this money should be spent, and possibly how this money should be possibly paid back if the cause does not exist anymore. While in the first 4 categories, if it's given to the poor, then it's complete transfer of ownership. They take this money, they have the liberty to do whatever they want with this money. So this is just a simple kind of example of an application that is based on that. The ayah used plural form for all of the 8 categories. And that also made the scholars think, okay, should we give more than one person of each category or not? Because it said for the poor people, so it's plural. Does it mean just the concept of poor, so one person suffices, or does it mean jam' plural, so I have to give 3, following the Arabic grammar logic, 3 at least of each category? That was something that was discussed based on the plural form. And then also some aspects of zakah were understood by the prophetic practice to be a state responsibility. So the Prophet ﷺ would appoint zakah workers and would manage them. And then there's a discussion about how zakah workers get their wages. They get it from zakah. They get it, how much they should get. What are the times in which the zakah workers do not actually qualify to receive zakah? So that's all something that the state government authority ruler will actually decide on. The question of al-mu'allafati qulubuhum, who decides that it's for the collective good to give this person who is a new Muslim who is going to help the collective benefit of the community, or possibly a non-Muslim by giving them money that would actually bring some kind of benefit to the Muslim community. This is the last point we'll highlight, conclude inshallah. The idea of contemporary definitional expansion. I'm sorry I'm going a little bit fast, but I'm just trying to stick to the time. These two examples are among the most maybe I would call controversial, but at the same time very important also discussions about today's practice of zakah. The idea of fi sabilillah, in the cause of Allah, that's an ongoing discussion in the community. What actually means in the cause of Allah? If 99% of traditional jurists said it's jihad, it's volunteers, people who are not listed basically in the army, they're not getting a wage or a salary from the government for them being enlisted in the army, they're just volunteering to participate in jihad activities, then they should be eligible for zakah. Well, can we expand that concept today to, for example, the common term used is intellectual jihad, is da'wah, writing books about Islam, or doing some kind of da'wah activities to non-Muslims, or combating Islamophobia, or lobbying on behalf of Muslims. All these questions about intellectual jihad was a discussion under, okay, can we expand fi sabilillah to include a lot of these kind of non-physical, direct, literal meaning of jihad that traditional scholars understood. And the second one is those whose hearts to be reconciled. So traditionally, it was a new Muslim who just needs money to come closer to Islam, or a new Muslim who just converted and he's very influential in his community, and then if we give them money, he might convince his clan or tribe, that was usually how they understood these dynamics socially and politically, then that will win us more people to join Islam, and that will be beneficial to the entire community. And then some madhahib, they would also say, also if a non-Muslim, and we know that if we give them money, they might consider being Muslims, or we might not necessarily care much about that, or maybe that's not the right phrase. We care, of course, about people becoming Muslims, but that's not really the point of giving them the money. Is giving them the money to prevent that he would actually prevent some kind of harm or threat that might happen to the community, so they will actually ward off that potential harm from us, then they might be eligible for zakah. Currently, a lot of discussion about this as well. How much we can use zakah in political activism and political lobbying. How much we can use zakah to possibly change the situation that is happening in Gaza, for example, here in the US. And again, back to the question of using the money domestically versus international relief. We could have possibly stopped the war like way before that. Hopefully it had already, alhamdulillah, stopped. We could have possibly done that if we had spent that money, and that's an argument, if we had spent that money more wisely for the sake of political lobbying, for example, to influence how, and this is, of course, kind of a fundamental part of how politics run in this country. Now you see there are a lot of traditional applications that actually would, in theory, make this very like a strong argument, because yeah, we have already precedents for that. It's not something new. The Prophet ﷺ gave money to people who had just become Muslims, and arguably some people who, before they became Muslims as well. And that was in the context of war and after the Battle of Hunayn, and he gave a lot of the Arab leaders money because he knew that these people are going to influence the tribes and that will bring a lot of benefit to the community. So we're talking about a lot of precedents that happened before. The tricky question about the expansion of this definition here is the problem of representation. And I'm sure Dr. Muhammad Fadl will talk about the idea of institutions in the absence of a unified kind of governing body for Muslims. Traditionally, and back to the idea of some zakah aspects being a state responsibility, a Muslim ruler / maybe government decides on that category. We decide to give money to that person or to that institution or to that country because that will bring collective good to the entire community. Now, if we don't have that in the United States, who has the legitimate representation on behalf of the Muslim community to decide that we're going to use zakah funds to pay for that political reason because we believe this is for the greater good of the entire community? So if Muslim Americans do not want Kamala Harris to win in the elections, and they want, let's say, Trump to win in the elections, and then they say, okay, we're going to donate $2 million or $10 million to Trump's campaign because that will bring us a greater good and that will possibly affect the situation in Palestine. So that's an argument that can be made. And then the argument here is that مؤلفة قلوبهم, this money can be used for political lobbying. The tricky question again is, who is the representative body / person or group of individuals who can actually decide on that and say we represent? It doesn't have to be like a exhaustive consensus 100%, that's kind of illogical, but like kind of majority or like a strong voice that represents the Muslim community that can act on behalf of the community in the absence of a kind of a Muslim leadership in a political sense and say we represent a large segment of the community, we're going to use some of the zakat funds for that. So the question of representation is very crucial here, and the question of what are the metrics of assessment of influence when it comes to the political sphere that would make zakat funds actually eligible to be spent in that. So I think these are again two very crucial ongoing discussions in the community, and I'm sure you will come up in multiple points of discussion today, inshallah. Thank you. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.